listening to An Amber a Day, the Functional Nutrition Podcast, and I'm Amber Fisher. Thank you so much for joining me today for this podcast. This is actually, as I'm recording right now, I'm recording episode 25. I'm not sure once I publish this if this will actually end up being episode 25, but it's a big milestone. Really kind of excited about it because, as those of you who've been following my podcast for a while know, I started this thing back in November of 2018, November 14th of 2018 to be exact. And over the last 2 years, I have lived a lot of life. So I've only gotten to 25 episodes in those 2 years because I had to take a little over a year off just to live the life that I was living. So I went through infertility, cancer, IVF, having a baby who was in the NICU. It's been a crazy couple of years. And I know everybody's had a crazy 2020, so I'm sure everyone can relate in their own way. We all have our own burdens, right? So I always start this podcast off by just, for those of you who are new, who have never listened before, what I talk about on this podcast is all things kind of functional nutrition based, but primarily I talk a lot about women's hormones, fertility, autoimmunity. Those are my two specialties. And then besides that, I talk a lot about myself, my own life. You know, I really like to think of myself as being this very authentic person who is very real, and I want to be trustworthy to you guys. And I believe that part of that process is by just being honest about myself, my own health issues, and everything, so you can really get to know me as a person and not just as this like phantom of a practitioner. So I think sometimes as practitioners we're a little bit too we want this like very distinct boundary between us and our clients or patients, and I think that those boundaries are starting to sort of dissolve a little bit with my generation. So I'm a friendly practitioner. I want you to get all the advice that you need and all the help that you need, but I also want you to have a good time doing it. And I like to really get to know you. So hopefully you will enjoy getting to know me as well. So first thing that I always talk about is what's going on with me. So as of the recording of this, I'm doing a lot of working. Thank you to all of you who have been, so patient with this transition with COVID and everything. I've made the decision to stay virtual for the foreseeable future, just because, as those of you who are moms understand, the whole childcare situation with COVID has gotten really complicated, hard to find a spot, especially one for a part-time parent. So anyway, I've made the tough decision to not go back into the physical office for a while. I still have opportunities for my San Antonio patients to like scan in and things like that. But as far as one-to-one consultations, it's all over the internet for right now. But the cool thing is that I've realized that this whole one-to-one conversation over Zoom or whatever is actually a really cool platform. I didn't give it much credit before. I sort of felt like it wasn't as good. And that's why I never really pursued it before. But now that I've done it for almost an entire year, I realized that really we get just as much out of these Zoom sessions as we would get face-to-face. And in fact, in a lot of cases, we get more because we have more time. I don't have to cut visits off, with a 15-minute window to like do this or that thing and prepare for the next person who's already waiting in the waiting room. There's not that stress because everybody's virtual. And it's kind of nice for y'all to not have to drive all the way to my office just so we can sit across from a desk from each other. It really, the longer I'm virtual, the more I realize that there's just a lot of things that like we were just used to doing and just thought that we had to do that I'm not totally sure really we needed to. So that's one good thing that's come out of 2020 is like I think a lot of people are realizing that, hey, virtual work is pretty cool. It also has its stressors, right? And I'll be honest that like lately, being at home with a 1-year-old who is just toddling around on everything, climbing on all the furniture, wanting to go places and do things, and not wanting to take his naps when he needs to take his naps. It's been a little stressful. So I talk about myself as if I'm basically working 2 full-time jobs. I mean, I'm seeing clients, I'm running my business, I'm running my practice, I'm running all the marketing for my practice. And then at the same time, I am also a full-time mom at home with my son every day. So to say it's been a tough year would be an understatement, but I really feel like in a lot of ways the toughest years are the ones you remember. They're the ones that really help you grow and mature and gain wisdom. And so we're all getting a lot of wisdom out of this year. And that's all I have to say about that. I am booking slots right now for discovery sessions for December. If you are interested in potentially me being your practitioner, I take on a very limited number of clients because I am part-time. So I only take on people that I really feel like, number one, that I can really help. Number two, that are really interesting to me. And so there's a process that we go to determine whether you and I would fit well as a client. And one of those things is that we do a discovery session. It's about an hour where we kind of go over your whole health history and all that. And so my business coach that I've been working with, which is another new thing that I'm up to, she mentioned that since I get so booked up, I might as well start informing people when I have slots opening up. So I do have about 6 slots left for December for discovery sessions. So if you're interested in getting on my calendar to potentially see if we might be a good fit to work together, definitely send me an email. You can find my information in the description box of this, wherever you're watching this. And you can also find me on Instagram, and you can DM me from there or whatever, and we'll get you set up. So that's that. 6 sessions. So if you want to be one of those 6, get in there quick because it does tend to fill up. And I'm not just saying that. It's not a sales strategy or marketing strategy. It really does tend to fill up because my schedule is pretty tight with the little baby. So, okay, enough of the stuff about housekeeping. I want to go over today's topic. So today, what I'm talking about is alcohol and fertility. For a long time, I've been meaning to do a podcast about alcohol because, believe it or not, it is actually one of the topics that I get the most questions about. It's interesting how dependent and reliant we are these days on alcohol as a stress reliever. So many women come to me hoping for help with fertility issues and don't even have a concept that alcohol could potentially be playing a role in their fertility issues. And I want to start off by saying, I'm not trying to demonize alcohol in this podcast. I'm really trying to give you the scientific viewpoint of it and then the viewpoint as I see it from my practice. And to be fair, nutrition research is complicated. There are a lot of different opinions about things. It's not always black and white. It's not always set in stone. But I've been doing this long enough and seen enough connections between people that I have a general idea of things that can set people back. And alcohol is definitely one of them. There's this sort of, I call it the cult of wine. So it's this concept that we've sort of created culturally. I don't know. You guys have probably noticed this. But over my adult life, I've noticed that increasingly we seem to see social and cultural references towards wine. Wine as being all the way from funny stuff about wine, giant wine glasses and things like that. But it's so pervasive in our culture now that it's almost become this thing where people really believe that it's the better option, or that it doesn't do the same kind of damage as other types of alcohol. So I think generally we would all agree that hard liquor, while a shot is great here and there, it's probably not the healthiest thing for you, right? Nobody's going around being oh yeah, tequila, it's a healthy drink. Maybe the keto people sometimes because, carbs. But most people would agree that okay, hard liquor, maybe not the best choice, that we don't drink alcohol generally for the health choice, we drink it for other reasons. But most people would agree on hard liquor. Beer, I think a lot of people, think of beer as being a bad sort of drink because of the gluten mostly. The alcohol content of beer is pretty low. So, there's a mixture of different opinions about beer. But wine seems to be this thing that we've all decided is like somehow vaguely healthy. Like, oh, it has resveratrol, it has antioxidants, like it might be good for my heart. Like some studies show that it might be good for my heart. And so we get this idea, and this is the same thing with coffee, where we like it, we want it, and so we're going to make it work. We're going to make it be this healthy thing that maybe it's really not. So you're not wrong. Like there are antioxidants in wine, particularly red wine, right? There's resveratrol in there, and resveratrol is something that is not present in a lot of different foods. It is present in chocolate, which might, be a better option, dark chocolate. So it does have certain health properties, but here's the thing, just because a food has health properties doesn't mean that it's a healthy food. Okay. So nutritionists know this because when we go through nutrition school, one of the funny things, like when I was going through my master's program, I came in there with like these very specific concepts of like good foods versus bad foods. And, like I was really into paleo. So I had this idea of like, okay, this is good, this is bad. And my master's program is going to play that out. Like I'm in the right here. And the more classes I took, as particularly biochemistry, the more I realized that almost every food has both beneficial and negative health properties. Like it has things in it that are good for us and things in it that are bad for us. And it's really about the balancing of the layers of that within the context of the rest of your diet, right? And so alcohol, particularly wine, is one of those things where it does have some health benefits. And so in the context of a person who's already otherwise healthy, who eats a healthy diet that has lots of antioxidants and lots of nutrients, a person who drinks purely socially and maybe has a glass of wine on the weekends, like that can be a very healthy part of the diet and might actually be heart protective. However, the way that I normally see this is people who, maybe it starts out with a glass on the weekend and then it goes to, either there's like two types of people, right? There's the people who drink on the weekend and when they drink on the weekend, they drink on the weekend, or there's the people who like drink every night. They drink a little bit, but they do it every single night. So, of course, that's caricature, right? Because a lot of people fall in the middle, I know. But yeah, so what's the balance? Like, what's right for you? The people listening to this podcast, you right now who's listening, more than likely you're a woman in your childbearing years. More than likely you have potentially like an autoimmune condition, or you have an infertility problem, right? And so you want to know what is healthy for you in your circumstance. And while I can't give like individualized advice on a podcast, I can tell you that if you're in those categories, more than likely alcohol, even wine, is not going to be doing you many favors. So that's what this podcast is all kind of about, is like, why is that? What's going on? And just how to understand the science and then what I see in my practice so that you can make the decision for yourselves. I'm not here to like make the decision for you. And let me give you a little personal anecdote. I grew up in the evangelical Christian tradition. I originally was part of the Church of Christ. Those of you who know what the Church of Christ is, it is a fundamentalist Christian organization, religion. What would you call it? I don't know. Denomination. There you go. It's a fundamentalist denomination that traditionally was very conservative and believed in like no instruments during worship. That's the big contention point. And one of the other things that they believed was in not drinking any alcohol. So I grew up, especially as a child, with this idea that alcohol was like, really bad for you, like only like certain types of people would drink. Like I didn't grow up with this sort of cultural understanding that we have now of like moderation around alcohol, or this kind of European vibe that's sort of gotten into our culture that's like, you can have some alcohol and And it's not a big deal. Like for me growing up, it was like no alcohol at all, or like, you know, you were just drinking a ton. So I didn't really understand until I got a little older that there could potentially be like a middle ground with that. And then, you know, in college, I started like, you know, the world got a little bit less rigid, less restrictive. We left the Church of Christ in favor of the more non-denominational denominations. And so things, you know, as I got into my teenage years and especially into my 20s, got a little bit less rigid, right? I could go out and have a margarita or something and it wasn't a big deal. So my point in saying that is that I went through a kind of difficult like processing point over alcohol, where if it could have been something that isn't a problem, like I would have loved that to be the case, because religion wise, I felt like as I got into my 20s that the way that I had been taught about alcohol was like really overkill. And I was like, okay, like rejecting a lot of that fundamentalism, right? And so I wanted to have a more balanced approach to a lot of different things, alcohol being one of them. And I certainly am not like all the way over to the never, ever, ever touch alcohol side either. But as I have grown up more, I have realized that especially the older you get, the more alcohol does really affect you in a negative way. And it's often better to just avoid it completely. I do drink socially, but it's pretty rare that I have a drink. Like I wouldn't even say that I have a drink weekly. If I could classify it or quantify it, I would say most of the time I'm having a drink less than once a month. So it's not something that I do regularly. And the main reason is because I just don't feel good doing it. But also because over time I have worked with enough women that I've learned some of the science on this. And I've seen this in practice and realized that really alcohol does not have a beneficial effect on me as a woman with fertility issues. So let's talk about that, right? Because you're probably like, okay, shut up about how alcohol is bad for me. Now tell me why it's bad for me so I can figure out if I want to actually give it up. Okay, so first of all, you know, there's the point to be made that like alcohol is toxic. It is a toxin. Like there's no way around that. It is a toxic substance that you're taking in through the mouth. Now, is it like drinking gasoline or something? No, but it is a toxin, and so your body has to filter it out. Your body has to process it, and your body, the cool thing is your body already has a detox system. It has the liver, and that's what the liver is for. The liver is for detoxing anything that we take in that we don't tolerate, and alcohol would be one of those things. So it has to go get processed through your liver, and then it moves on into your different detox pathways. Either it's, you know, you take it out through the urinary system or the digestive system. For alcohol, it's primarily through the urinary system. But in the meantime, it circulates in your bloodstream, and it gets into all of the places in your body. It goes everywhere because, you know, your blood goes everywhere. So in that meantime, while that liver is trying to process the alcohol that you drank, everything else has to go on hold. So if you're losing weight, it has to go on hold. If you are trying to filter and process excessive hormones, like in the case of estrogen dominance or PCOS, it has to go on hold. And so you can see how if you're drinking alcohol, particularly like every night, how you could run into a problem. And I have seen this because a lot of people are like confused about why alcohol seems to make them gain weight in a way that doesn't make a lot of sense given how many calories they're eating. So you think of a typical glass of wine, like if you're, you know, and those of you who know about like what a real like pour is, know it's like 4 to 5 ounces. So if you're watching the video of this is like a little bit of wine in a glass. It's not even the glass isn't even halfway full, and that's technically a glass of wine. So if you've got a wine glass and you're filling it up to the top, for the average woman, that's like 2 to 3 glasses of wine. Just FYI, in case you didn't know that. Most people know that, but if you didn't know that, now you know. The more you know. So, with that said, like, one glass of wine is, depending on the wine, around like 200 calories. Okay, so it's not that much. And so, if you're eating a pretty healthy diet, you're probably in a calorie deficit. You might be on the pathway towards losing weight. You might be detoxing fat from your cells, and that's going through your liver and all of that. Well, when you drink alcohol, it's funny because even though it's 200 calories, for some reason, for a lot of women, it seems to make them gain weight, even though they're already on a calorie deficit, or they've worked it into their calorie deficit. And for some women, it seems to mess up the math. So they might be diligently counting calories and know their metabolic rate and all that, but yet it seems like the weight's not coming off while they're drinking this wine. And I've seen this many, many times. We could get into a whole discussion about whether calories matter or not. Suffice it to say that in my years of practice, I have found that calories do matter. So sorry to give you news that you don't want. They do matter. They are not everything. There are many factors that go into metabolism, but calories do matter. And so that's what's interesting about wine is it's one of those things, or alcohol, it's one of those things that can alter the math and make it not make sense anymore. So, what's going on with that? Well, the liver is taking its time to process that alcohol, and while it's processing that, it's overwhelmed with that. It can't work on other things. And, we know that that alcohol is directly damaging to the liver. Of course, in moderation, it's not going to be as big of a deal as if you were, an alcoholic. However, there's still damage being done, okay? And so that damage that's being done, the real issue with women who have fertility problems is that oftentimes those women already have a sluggish liver. The liver and the gallbladder are very important for hormonal function, hormone creation, hormone processing, all that stuff. So they often are already sluggish because they're already under a lot of stress. Add in alcohol to that mix and you're just adding fuel to this fire. And so it's not a recipe for success. We live already in a very toxic world. Like especially if we already have health conditions, then we're already under a lot of stress. But even the average healthy person, we're living in a time when there's toxicity all around us. And so our livers are really working overtime to process everything that we're eating, everything that we're breathing, all this different stuff that's coming into our bodies, drinking. Alcohol simply makes that process harder. It makes that process take longer. And what I have noticed is that across the board, it makes things slow down. So it makes it very difficult to lose weight. Losing weight is often a big part of fertility diets, especially if you have PCOS. Like, there's no way around that. Sometimes a little bit of weight loss is important for this process, right? And alcohol is going to slow that process down. The other thing that alcohol does, and we know this scientifically outside of the fact of whether you have a food sensitivity to it or not, because you can have a food sensitivity to wine or to beer or whatever. But even if you don't, alcohol directly inflames the intestine. So we know that it causes a certain level of inflammation on the lining of the intestine. And what's the problem with that? We all eat things that inflame our intestines here and there, right? Like gluten is somewhat inflammatory to the intestinal lining, and yet many of us eat gluten a fair amount. I am not I don't eat gluten-free. So, although many of my clients do for various health reasons, but most of us, we consume some gluten here and there. And that's something that's difficult on our intestine to break down and absorb and all that. But alcohol really does that in such a very, what's the word I'm trying to say? It really affects the intestine almost immediately. And the problem with that is that if you have fertility issues and if you have autoimmunity, we know, if you've listened to other podcasts of mine on the priority pyramid, you know that there are certain things that are more important for the body than others, right? And the hormonal balance is at the bottom of the list. So it's at the top of the pyramid. It's like the last thing that gets taken care of. If there's imbalances there, we know that we have to look deeper. And the deepest place we can look in the body is the immune system, which is 80% of which is in the gut. And so we know that gut health plays a huge role in whether we are properly creating hormones, whether our hormones are balanced. The gut is often the genesis of autoimmune conditions. So there's usually food sensitivities involved with autoimmune conditions of every kind. And so there's a lot going on in the gut, right? So the last thing we want to do is add something in that's going to actively undo any healing work that we've done. And keep in mind that this is a process. Like, gut healing is a process. It's something where you take 2 steps forward and you might take 1 step back. Like, it's not all going to happen overnight. It doesn't happen immediately. It's not something that you make a few changes and you know, everything gets perfect. It's like there's always going to be things that are going to be difficult on the gut. And especially at the beginning of the healing process, you know, your gut's still going to be somewhat inflamed, and there's a process to it. But what we know about alcohol is that it actively sort of breaks down the work that you're doing. So when we're talking about gut healing in particular with people with fertility conditions and autoimmune conditions, alcohol is like such a no-no, because it's something that it's a variable that we actually have control over. Like, we don't have control over everything that goes into the mouth and potentially affects the intestine, but we do have control over whether we drink alcohol or not. Why would we drink something that we know is going to cause problems with the gut and is going to undo some of the work that we've done? So it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. If you have not listened to my podcast on the jar theory and on the priority pyramid, I highly recommend those. Those are basically the 2 kind of sentinel works that I have on, like, my approach to the body and how I think about the body as I'm making, you know, plans for people and everything. So I recommend those if you haven't listened to those already, and that'll help make some of this other gut stuff make sense, because I get sick of talking about the gut all the time. Functional nutrition. I mean, those of you who follow other like functional nutritionists know that, like, inevitably 90% of our work comes back to the gut. You know, like, I got into this to do hormone stuff and I end up doing gut stuff because that's just where it all begins, right? You know, not 100%, but there's definitely like a lot going on there that we always have to address. So, but I get sick of talking about the gut and gut health and everything over and over again. So if you haven't listened to those, listen to those, and it'll make a little bit more sense if you're kind of confused right now. But let's talk about some more things that alcohol does. So we know for sure that alcohol also depletes some nutrients. And this is another problem that we have, because especially if we're dealing with fertility issues or autoimmune issues, we know that we're already dealing with a state of nutrient depletion, right? Like, for example, PCOS. We often have depleted B vitamins there because sometimes women with PCOS don't methylate properly. They have that MTHFR gene mutation, which makes them not absorb B vitamins as well. Not everyone with PCOS has that, but it's more common in PCOS. Same thing with autoimmunity. I mean, a lot of people have that mutation, but we're often dealing with lower levels of vitamins because either we're not absorbing them properly, we're not eating enough of them, whatever it may be. So alcohol, we know, depletes us of a lot of those nutrients. So what does it deplete us of? Well, number one, it depletes us of magnesium, which is an important electrolyte. So a lot of people who drink a fair amount of alcohol know that alcohol is real dehydrating, right? Like, if you drink wine, you wake up the next day and you've got that headache, that hangover, that has a lot to do with dehydration because it actively depletes you of some of your mineral resources, which are important for that water balance. We know that alcohol is very dehydrating. It makes it very difficult for the muscles to retain a certain level of like glucose and a certain level of sodium, magnesium, all these kind of electrolytes that sort of keep things balanced. And the problem with that is that if we are actively messing with our hydration status, it makes it harder for our body to create energy. So it leads to this sort of chronic fatigue. So it's sort of a vicious circle Because a lot of times people drink alcohol after a long day because it sort of perks you up because it has the sugar in it. It sort of perks you up. But it actually in the long run can lead to this muscle fatigue, especially if you're athletic. So it's really better to avoid a lot of that. And if you go on the internet, you can find a lot of articles written by like sports nutrition, like colleges and things like that for athletes about what alcohol does to an athletic body, because it messes so much with the hydration status that it really makes your performance suffer. So there's that. But magnesium's a big one because magnesium is really important for like 300 different enzymatic processes in the body. It works at like every level, every cellular level of your body. It's important. And so the little sign that you might be magnesium deficient, magnesium deficiency is sort of associated a little bit with anxiety. And so sometimes people will take magnesium at night, and it is kind of calming, kind of soothing. What often happens to people too is if you get Charlie horse cramps, like cramps in your feet or in your calves, a lot of times that can be a magnesium deficiency. And I actually see that more commonly than I see it being like a potassium deficiency or anything like that. I see magnesium more often. And I actually one of the ways that I became interested in magnesium before I was ever a nutritionist was I was in my early 20s, and like everybody else, I liked to go out and have a good time with my friends, but maybe we were having a few too many good times, and I started noticing I was like getting Charlie horse cramps in my feet like all the time, and I was like, what is the deal with this? Well, somebody told me to try magnesium. I think I read it on a blog or something. I tried magnesium. All of a sudden it fixed the problem. And I was like, oh, okay, so I'm deficient in magnesium. Well, I didn't put two and two together until like years later that, oh, I get it. I was drinking so much alcohol that I was actually dehydrating myself and messing with my electrolyte balance, which was then was leaving the conditions for me to get cramps. And so, those cramps are like, they're annoying. They're not like the end of the world, but they are a sign of a deeper issue going on with hydration. And hydration is very important for our cellular function. So that's one thing that alcohol depletes. Alcohol also depletes B vitamins. B vitamins are super important for your egg quality, ladies. So if you're having issues with, if you're getting ready to do fertility treatments, to take Clomid or go through IVF and do a retrieval, and you're worried about your egg quality, there are some things that can be done that help benefit egg quality, and having a good steady level of B vitamins is one of them. B vitamins, they are water soluble. And what that means is that they flush out of your body fairly regularly. So they're not like vitamin D that stays around and gets stored. They just continuously are used and flushed out of your body. So many people do need to take supplemental B vitamins, especially if they don't methylate properly. But even if you're a person who's like eating really well and you're eating a lot of vegetables, which is where you get a lot of B vitamins, but if you're drinking alcohol, then you're depleting those B vitamins. And so it's sort of like this cycle where, you might be doing everything right, but if you're drinking too much alcohol, and too much is different for different people, but if you're drinking too much alcohol, you're sort of negating a lot of that work that you're doing to try to be healthy with your diet and maybe to take supplements and things like that. So it's important to, think about those things too. A big thing, and this is like gets very personal for me. A big thing about alcohol that scares me a lot is that it increases what we call aromatase, which is the precursor to estrogen and androgen hormone, so testosterone. So estrogen and testosterone, they're kind of made from the same thing. And women with PCOS know this because usually women with PCOS have excessive estrogens and they have excessive androgens. So they've got a lot of testosterone going on. That's where you get like facial hair and things like that. But, carrying weight around the belly is partially a testosterone thing, partially an insulin thing. And those two things are connected too. But essentially you've got this process happening where you are not ovulating regularly, and so you're getting this overwhelming dominance of estrogen that's not being counteracted by progesterone, because progesterone is only produced when you ovulate, and estrogen can be produced all the time. Not only that, but fat cells produce estrogen. So if you're overweight, you have excessive fat cells, you're making this estrogen too. And so sometimes women with PCOS, this doesn't come out on blood work, or it's still within the normal range. But when you look at it versus how much progesterone they make when they ovulate, you can see that there's an imbalance there. And alcohol increases the substrate that those things are made from. So you drink alcohol and you're adding fuel to the fire of having excessive estrogen dominance or excessive androgen hormones. So that's scary because, for me, of course, those of you who have listened to my podcast for a while know that I have had endometrial cancer, which is an estrogen-based cancer. I have no genetic markers for cancer, and I've had full panel run. Like I have no family history of estrogen-based cancers, but I did get an estrogen-based cancer purely because I had PCOS and I had a very severe version of estrogen dominance. And it's something that I still struggle with to this day. It's there's a lot to that, but certainly drinking alcohol, while I'm not saying that it caused me to get cancer, it didn't help things. And so, I live by this philosophy of that everyone deserves one vice. Okay. So I really think that if you're 90% a healthy eater, you can afford in moderation to have, something that maybe is quote unquote unhealthy. Because there's health for the body and then there's health for the soul too, right? And some foods and things are comforting and that means something. That doesn't just mean nothing. And so if alcohol is your, vice of choice and you want to enjoy it on occasion, there's no problem with that. However, for me, given my history of PCOS and estrogen dominance and endometrial cancer, I choose to, for the most part, make the decision not to drink alcohol because I don't want to do something that I know directly impacts that problem. So, I think it's something to keep in mind, right? Like if you have a food sensitivity to whey, to dairy, you are probably, of course you might love cheese, but it's probably a better idea to find something else that maybe is like not the best choice, maybe gluten or something, and have that instead of having cheese as your like vice of choice, right? We all have to make decisions about what things we're willing to give up, what things we want to limit, and what things we want to have more flexibility with. And alcohol is certainly one of those things that's controversial. It's one of those things that everybody has to make the right decision for themselves. But, I would implore you, if you are dealing with a hormone imbalance, to limit the alcohol, because I just think it makes things worse. I've seen that in practice. I just don't think it's worth I don't think the momentary pleasure of it is worth the consequences that come later if you're a regular drinker. Okay. One other thing that we know that alcohol does is it reduces human growth hormone. There's not a ton known about this, but if you have been following fertility clinics for a while, you know that there's like this trend of putting people on human growth hormone while they're going through an IVF cycle, because there's been some research that shows that maybe human growth hormone has something to do with egg quality and everything like that. We know that alcohol depletes human growth hormone, which is one reason why it's so bad for athletes and why it messes with performance so much. But we also think that there might be a connection between that and egg quality. And egg development in particular. So, if you are going through a fertility cycle in the next 4 to 6 months, it would be wise to limit your alcohol or give it up altogether throughout that time, because it takes a good 4 months for the full cycle of egg development to sort of take place. So Usually we talk about that, and making changes a month before you have an IVF retrieval, it's still going to help, like, don't get me wrong, but you're going to see much better results if you really focus on that preconception care with like 4 to 6 months before. So an alcohol reduction is one of those things. In men, I don't talk a ton about men, but we do know that alcohol increases estrogen in men. There's that aromatase again, but it actually decreases testosterone in men. And so that will affect sperm count, motility, quality, all that stuff. And it takes 2 to make a baby. So if he's not healthy, it's also can be a problem. My experience as a practitioner has been that, oftentimes the type of women that I see, I feel very fortunate that I work with a lot of women who are, what I would consider similar to me. They are women who, have careers that they really care about. They have, maybe they're moms. They're kind of like powerful women, right? They take care of themselves, and they're really ambitious, and they have a lot that is on their plate. And that's great. But when we are like that, when we have the stresses of raising children, or we have the stresses of a job, or both, we sometimes rely too much on external things to reduce our stress. I'm not going to go too much into stress reduction in this because we're already approaching 40 minutes, but suffice it to say that while alcohol does temporarily reduce your stress, it adds to stress on your body in so many ways that I think that the net benefit is not there. My advice to women who are trying to conceive, or who are trying to heal from an autoimmune condition, is this. If you are trying to conceive in the next 4 to 6 months, ideally you would completely eliminate alcohol. And that's just ideal. I don't expect that most women will do that completely, because, holidays and special occasions are like bound to happen during that time. But I would advise that you get as close to 0 with it as possible. Just rather be safe than sorry, right? If you are a woman trying to heal from autoimmunity or trying to find a better balance there, I also recommend complete elimination, at least for the first month to 2 months, and then maybe increasing how much you have, but very small, in moderation. I recommend that if you do drink, that you drink 1 glass, not 2, not 3, and that it's a real glass, a 5-ounce pour, and not any more than that. And that you do that no more, for the average healthy woman, I would say I would do that no more than like once or twice a week. I just think that that's probably the max that I would do, that I would feel comfortable with, and that I would tell my clients to do. Because I've always fallen the opinion of better safe than sorry. So, that's just where I'm at with that. Now, as I said, that's just general advice. There are many different factors to consider. There are many different women, and your bodies are all different, and your health statuses are all different. And I know that, some of the people that listen to this are already really healthy people, and you're just interested in nutrition and everything. And so you might be thinking that sounds a little restrictive for you. Maybe it is. However, I always believe in telling the truth, even if the truth is hard to hear. And one thing I will say is that with alcohol, even social drinkers, I have found that there is a lot of denial in women over their alcohol consumption. Not only with how much they're actually drinking, but with how dependent they are on it for stress relief and for having a good time. So I think the best advice there is just to, first of all, if you want to be really practical about this, keep a journal. Keep a food diary and mark down anytime you have a drink and how much you have and what you have and how you feel the next day. But I think it's worthwhile to just sort of sit with your emotions around it. I think a lot of people will probably have skipped this podcast because they know what I'm going to say and they don't want to hear it. And so if you're one of those people who, you considered skipping it, but you ended up getting through it, but you're feeling kind of like a little bit annoyed or angry or irritated at what I'm saying, Trust me, I get that because I get really irritated when people tell me what to do. Excuse me. So if you're getting really irritated about me telling you what to do, my only advice is just to sit with that. Like, try to figure out where that irritation and anger is coming from. Is it because you really think I'm wrong and that I'm exaggerating? Or is it because, maybe that maybe there's a little truth to what I'm saying and you maybe don't want to admit it to yourself? I mean, it could be either. It could be either for you. So you have to make those decisions for yourself. If you want a nutritionist perspective, you can book one of my 6 discovery calls coming up in December. But generally, healthy person who is not going through fertility or autoimmunity stuff, I would say twice a week. The actual studies on fertility related effects of alcohol, most of them have to do with drinking 5 or more drinks a week, but there are some that show adverse effects from 1 to 5 drinks a week. So better safe than sorry. So yeah, that's all I have for you guys today on alcohol. So thank you for listening. And just a couple of things before you turn to your next podcast or the radio or whatever you're going to do. If you have questions for the podcast on anything nutrition, fertility, motherhood related, I'm happy to answer your questions on the podcast. So I don't do a time for questions on the podcast at this moment. I might in the future as I get more questions, because I do get some questions, but not enough to do an entire feature on a bunch of questions. But I do use you guys' questions as fuel for creating new podcasts. So you give me ideas about what things you want me to talk about. So truthfully, there is no question that is too dumb or too ignorant. I'm happy to answer anything. So don't feel nervous or weird about approaching me and asking me a question. You can send an email to the podcast. The email address is annamberadaypodcast@gmail.com. You can also DM me on Instagram and ask me your questions. But that is all I have for you today. So I'm going to go ahead and sign off. Thank you guys so much for listening, and I hope you have a really good week. Talk to you soon. Bye.